black people couldn't eat them at all. Some restaurants would be segregated. Most would have a takeout counter if you were black, and you could come up and use your food to go and eat it in the parking lot or eat it somewhere else. When hotels and motels become a thing, most of them would rent to African Americans. It would be very awkward in the 20th century when we started having the United Nations in New York City. Occasionally, African countries, like Africa, would send diplomats to Washington, D.C. to meet with Congress, and they couldn't stay in hotels in Washington, D.C., which is a segregated city. And so the federal government had to, it was between Maryland and Virginia, right? So the federal government had to sort of quietly come up with a deal whereby it was sort of known that if you were a diplomat from an African country, you could stay like this or that hotel, it would be fine, right? And so there was a book that the NAACP published called the Green Book, which is essentially a directory of places that you could go to eat and spend the night in the South. Sometimes it was just people that would rent a room that every year they would call and check and find names. But that way, if you were traveling in the South, you would be able to sort of find a place to stay. Right? You'd be able to call up someplace and tell them you're coming, and they would have a room and you could use. And so a few years ago, Stephen King wrote a book called 11/22/63 about the Kennedy assassination, and there's a scene where the main character's traveling through the South and talking about the 50s, and sort of how great it seems in some respects to the present because he's from the future, right? And so he talks about how stuff is cheaper and people seem nicer and whatever, but things like, but just in case you were wondering though, there's like some bad stuff too, and he tells a story about how he goes to a gas station, right? And the guy's gonna fill up his car and sort of check the tires and stuff, so he goes to take a walk, goes to the bathroom, and he walks down to the creek behind the gas station, and the bathroom says whites only, and he wonders like, is there not a bathroom for black people? And he wanders down to the creek, and in the creek bed is a bunch of broken beer bottles and stuff, and there is a bathroom, and the bathroom is a 2x4 chained up to two poles hanging over the creek full of broken bottles, right? And so the guy sits there and thinks about like, what if you had a little girl and she had to like climb out on this in the middle of a rainstorm to go to the bathroom, and what if she fell into the creek bed full of sharp glass bottles or something? And that's a fictional story, except it's actually probably absolutely true. That kind of stuff absolutely happened.
So this lasted all the way to like
to the 1960s.
Like
yeah.
this is crazy.
Like people that are alive today grew up. Like my mother was a nurse in the 60s and lived in the segregated state of Texas.
I know I sound ignorant, but God, I didn't know. Like if you really think about it, it's like over 50.
The one good thing you say, if you want to know that like there's some psychic justice, the black guy who was president was like born when this stuff was legal and lived long enough to become, grew up to become a president.
Puts it in perspective, like it's
yeah.
A few years ago, I think it was probably like 2013, I was touring the campus of Duke, and the week that I went, it was they were celebrating 50 years of Duke being integrated, and I was like, that is no time at all. And I was there with my grandfather, who's in his like mid-70s, and he was like, yeah, I lived through that. Of course I remember that happening.
Yeah, and that was when they started to get to be a really good school. In the 40s, when Nixon went to Duke, it was not that great of a school. And in the 50s and 60s, it really started. They called it the Southern Ivies, and they started to really get to be a good school, and they integrated it. And if you ever see Mississippi, they had riots, and then this school burned down, and there were shooting, people got shot, and Kennedy had to send in the National Guard. And if you go to the student union, they kept the facade, and there's bullet holes in the facade from the riots, and that was 1961.
It's so crazy.
That happened.
It's right before, like, I was born in the 80s, but if you're really
Yeah, I mean, it's not
far,
that
like, not long
ago at all.
I grew up in Georgia, kind of, I grew up going to high school there, but like, there's signs everywhere. Like, you might not like, if you think about it, you see it, but no one really talks about it. But like, the middle school in the town used to be like black high school. They're separate grade, like cemeteries for whites and blacks. It's everywhere.
Crazy.
I mean, that's, and the other thing we can mention too is my other least favorite hobby horse is if you go to every southern town had a Nathan Bedford Forrest High School, and the reason they had Nathan Bedford, seriously, Windows, I totally did open, that was not lying, thanks. If you look at the schools, they named these schools after Nathan Bedford Forrest in the 50s. And the reason they did it was when the civil rights movement started. Rather than agreeing to integrate the schools, they renamed the school after a guy who was the founder, the first guy in charge of the KKK. And Jacksonville had a Forrest High School, and they renamed it Forrest in 1949 or 50 when the school was built. They built the school, and it was just like unnamed Westside High School, and then when the school board got together, they named it Nathan Bedford Forrest. So imagine being a black kid going to school, had a name for a guy that had the KKK. And then a few years ago, they had hearings to rename it. They were going to name it Martin Luther King High School. And the school board voted against that proposal by 1 vote. But people came and testified, like, oh, well, it's part of the history of the town.
Right.
No. It was named this in the 40s specifically as an FU to black people. And Forrest never visited Florida that we know of at all. Never visited Jacksonville. It's not like he lived here.
Yeah, it's crazy just to look at the statistics of when most Confederate monuments were erected.
Yeah, most of them were erected in the 50s or later.
During the Civil Rights period, as a manner of saying, like, we still are suppressing you, don't get any ideas.
And the whole argument, I had a student ask me this last semester what I thought about Confederate monuments, and my personal opinion is that they should all be taken down. And she was like, oh, I would think as a history teacher you would want them. It's like, well, yeah, but they weren't, these aren't erected in the 19th century.
It's not a good.
In context, they were erected specifically as a sort of a show of like, oh, so you're black and you're upset about this, like, we put a giant statue of the guy that you should not like, right? And Georgia's state flag in the 50s had the stars of the Confederate battle flag on the flag.
It was on the recent. It was that.
It was changed in like the 2000s.
Yeah, it was recent.
And for again, like going back to the schools in Georgia, it's like super rural counties where like there's no room for private schools whatsoever. People can't even afford it. In the 60s, private schools were popping up all over.
They call them segregation academies. Because if, sure, let them integrate the schools, but we'll just all send our kids to. And actually, the big thing that got a lot of Southern Baptist churches into politics, they say that it was Roe v. Wade and the abortion and it became illegal and they really got mobilized. Also, for a lot of the big churches, it was the fact that they all had tax-exempt Bible schools. And it was a perfect way to avoid integrating the schools, right? You just say, well, everybody in our church will pay money, we'll start a little school, and everybody's kids can go there and they don't have to go to school with anybody who's black, because nobody black in our church. And they were really worried in the 70s that the federal government was gonna not let you run tax-exempt schools unless they were integrated as well. And that caused a lot of the churches to decide, like, maybe we should go out there and vote for candidates who will prevent this from happening. And so again, the Southern Baptist Convention exists because in the 19th century, the Baptists got into a fight over ordaining black ministers and supporting slavery. And so, not to say that everybody who's a Southern Baptist is a monstrous racist, that's certainly not the case today, but that was a big strain, particularly in the South, of running through the Southern Baptist churches. And there's the whole, we'll all create a private school, and we can send whoever we want to it, and private schools don't fall under the kind of civil rights laws that would require the integration of public schools, right? And then that's it, right? And that's why like school privatization is a scary issue, right? And then if you listen to the discussion today, for example, about businesses that deny homosexual people the right to serve the business, I just want to be able to serve who I want. Well, the reason people get touchy about that is during segregation, business owners would often say, well, I don't have to serve black people if I don't want to, right? And there was that whole argument of like, oh, it's my property, I should be able to do what I want, it's my business. That was used by essentially pro-segregation business owners to deny black people service. The governor of Georgia, Lester Maddox, got the job because he threw black customers who were protesting his segregated business out of his business with an axe handle. He chased them out of the store. And he ran campaign ads for governor holding the axe handle and got elected governor twice.
Recent?
Yeah, this is in the 60s.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that was the whole argument, was it's my business, I don't have to let anybody in I don't want to. And it's like, well, true, but, and that's why.
If you're having a business in the community, you need to.
That's the counter argument.
Yeah.
But that's why today, when you hear those arguments again regarding gay rights, that's why people get touchy, because it's like we've heard this stuff before.
Yeah, and you're coming.
So in any case, again, imagine practically everything being segregated, right? Everything. The movie theaters were segregated. The upper balcony was reserved for African Americans only. And so it's hard to argue, it's hard to sort of, like everything, all of it is segregated, right? And so it became, I think, hard for people to understand, because if you were a person old enough to see this happen, you could remember it being different. But if you grew up in like the 19-teens or 20s, this was just like the way things were, right? You just would go through your life and you probably would never even interact with an African American other than a person like cleaned your house or like picked up your garbage or something like that. They were totally invisible to you because they went to a separate school and they just shopped at separate stores and they didn't eat restaurants where you did and you never see them. My mother's stepfather substitute taught at a high school, and so she came home from school one day and you said, oh, how was school? And she said, we had a pep rally. And she said, the football team got new uniforms. And it was great. They let us out of class and we all went and did a pep rally and sang the school fight song and cheered and everything. And he said, yeah, I know you got new football uniforms, because he substitute taught at the local black school. And he said, the black football team in our school, they got the old uniforms that your school got rid of. And so she had a way to know about this stuff that probably very few people in high school would have even considered. And so having said that, That's the way the South is going to be until the end of this class. Right? When we get to the end of this class, talk about the 50s and 60s, the Civil Rights Movement. That's what the Civil Rights Movement is about. Right? The twin sort of things: the denial of the right to vote, and then Jim Crow on the other hand. Right? And so we'll return to this again at the end of the class. Right? And so the very last thing we mentioned: how do you enforce this stuff? Well, that's as it turns out is the rub. And so you can see here a pretty typical picture of a lynching. And so the trick is, some of this stuff is law, and you could run people in for violating it. The most segregated ordinances are like civil misdemeanors, like speeding tickets and stuff. And you could get fined for violating a segregated ordinance. You could get fined for going into the wrong restaurant or whatever. But sometimes a lot of these things were customary, right? Like, for example, if you're an African American, don't ever call a white person by their first name. They're Mr. and Mrs. They don't have to do that to you. If you're walking on the street, step out of the way of somebody. And so if you're a black person, you go in a store and doesn't have a segregated area, expect to be served after all white people in the store. If someone comes in, expect to be moved to the back of the line. And of course, if you make a fuss about any of this stuff, then what would happen is a lynch mob, right? And so lynchings were typically, the few things you say about lynchings is they're extra legal, right? And so there are legal ways for the judicial system to execute people. It's the death penalty, right? If you get convicted of a certain crime, if we have a death penalty hearing, if you get sentenced to whatever, this is not that. This is a spontaneous sort of just people gather, they form a mob, they kill people. The other point about lynchings is they're public, right? There's pictures of this. These two guys have been beaten and were hanging in the town square. They're also smiling. Yeah, this is in like that. It's like it's not a bad thing, right? And the thing about lynching is also intended to serve as a public warning, right? The point about a lynching is so people are supposed to see it, right? The next black guy to walk down the street is going to know if you walk under this tree that like this happened and you should not do whatever like these guys did, right? Whatever they were accused of doing, right? And so a lot of lynchings, a good percentage of them, had to do with the biggest, most significant rule, which is if you're a black man, don't ever talk to a white woman, right? Don't have anything to do with a white woman. The assumption automatically, we should ask, what's the assumption automatically if a black man has any interaction with a white woman whatsoever? What's he going to do?
Rape, yeah.
Right, and if a white woman was found out to have had a relationship with a black man, clearly it wasn't, she didn't want to, she was raped, right? And so the best book about the South you could probably read is To Kill a Mockingbird, and then that story involving that is a central plot point in the book, right? And so, which is not to say that there weren't women that didn't want interracial relationships or whatever, but the assumption was just that if you were a self-respecting white woman, would be the phrase, you simply wouldn't want to do that, right? And if you were a black guy, and it was even remotely thought that you might have done that, you might get lynched for the very idea, right? You might get lynched for the very possibility that something like this would happen. A lot of other lynchings, a good probably 70%, are about enforcing these kind of unwritten segregated rules, right? Not that these guys might have done a specific thing, like tried to go to the restaurant they shouldn't have gone to. It's that they were acting in a way that didn't reinforce the notions of segregation or the sort of the notions of their social inferiority. And so segregation had to be taught a lesson, right? And so, as it turns out, it's hard to know numbers of lynchings. It probably, in the 1890s, that's one decade, probably about 1,500 lynchings occurred across the South, which is a fairly high number. It got a little higher in the turn of the 20th century. It declined pretty dramatically. The black press, the black newspapers, they covered that extensively. The Chicago Defender and the Toledo Blade are the two big ones. The Chicago Defender is the largest black newspaper in America, and they made a point of covering lynchings because obviously no white newspaper would even cover them, right? The national newspapers would occasionally mention in the New York Times in the back pages, but the local papers typically didn't even talk about it, right? The NAACP made a point of trying to do something about it, to cover it, right? And so one of the founders of the NAACP is a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois. He's the first African American to graduate with a PhD from Harvard in sociology, wrote a number of very good books, A History of Reconstruction, a very good essay about being black in America, he called The Souls of Black Folk. He pointed out that if you're a black person in America, you're American, you're also black, and America doesn't ever let you forget that the second part is a thing. And so he covered these for the NAACP, wrote about them. And he quit. And he quit one time because he came, I want to say, to South Carolina or Georgia. There had been a lynching. He came, he worked it all out over the phone with a young guy who was going to meet him at the train station. He was going to stay with the guy while he covered, went and got the information and wrote up an article for it. Then he got off the train, and the guy met him. and the guy said, look, we're gonna walk down the street to the hotel or whatever, and he said, we're gonna walk past the store and I'll point it out, and the